There are three fatal flaws in orthodoxy that, in my opinion, make it totally untenable. In this video, I'm going to walk you through these three arguments and show you why I don't think the Orthodox position makes any sense and why the Catholic position actually makes a lot of sense. But before we go any further, if you are an Orthodox Christian and you disagree with me or you think I misrepresent some position in Orthodoxy, please let me know in the comments. I certainly am not infallible. I'm not the Pope. So let's go ahead and take a look at this first argument. The first fatal flaw that I see in orthodoxy is that, oddly enough, there are no orthodox quote mines. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the major objections that the Orthodox will leverage against Catholics is that we're quote mining. We go through and we take certain passages from certain saints and councils and we just shove them all together into a document or into an online article, and then we go through and say, look, the papacy, look, the papacy, look, the papacy. And then the Orthodox have to go through and explain why each and every single one of those is not actually a statement of papal supremacy. Well, here's the problem that I have with that. Let's suppose that the Catholic position about papal supremacy, which is laid out in Vatican I, which by the way is much more modest than what most Orthodox people think that it is. Let's suppose that that's false. Well, where is the Orthodox counterposition? If it is the case that Christ did not intend for the Pope to be supreme, but rather for ecumenical councils to be supreme or for all bishops to be equal in some way, it should be easy for the Orthodox to provide a list of quotes showing that the Church Fathers taught that. But the problem is there's really not a ton of quotes from the Fathers that show that Christ instituted this conciliar model. And this is why whenever there are debates between Catholics and Orthodox, it's always the Catholics who are bearing the burden of proof about the papacy. Now, granted, it's not that there are no Church Fathers who seem to indicate that the Church has some sort of a conciliar foundation. You can look at Firmilian and Cyprian for an example of that. However, this conciliar model was never widespread throughout the entire Church. It was never universal, certainly not in the West, and I would argue certainly not even in the East. So why is this first argument so strong in my opinion? Well, if you look at the early Church and what they taught about the papacy, there are literally dozens and dozens of quotes from councils, from Church Fathers, that suggest that the Pope has some sort of authority, supreme authority, not just an honorific, but a real authority over the other bishops in the Church. And this is all prior to the schism. So I'm going to go through and just share three of these with you, but know that there are literally dozens more that seem to suggest that Peter is supreme in authority. And not just Peter, but his successors as well, obviously. Pope St. Leo says this: although bishops have a common dignity, they are not all of the same rank. Even among the most blessed apostles, though they were alike in honor, there was a certain distinction of power. All were equal in being chosen, but it was given to one to be preeminent over the others. So today, through the bishops, the care of the universal Church would converge in the one see of Peter, and nothing should ever be at odds with this head. Pope St. Leo here is saying that all the apostles and all the bishops are equal in a common dignity. However, they are not equal in power. And where does the supreme power abide? In Peter and his successors. Sometimes Orthodox will take this quote and say, look, all bishops have a common dignity. And that is true. Even today, we would say that all priests have a common dignity, all bishops have a common dignity, but at the same time, they are not equal in their power and authority. So there's a distinction that can be made. Equal in dignity, yes. Equal in authority, no. And this is what Pope Leo is laying out here. Pope Leo, who by the way is regarded as a saint in the East and the West, is laying out this ecclesiology that suggests very strongly, I think, that the Pope has a power and authority over the other bishops in the Church. Next, here's a quote from Pope St. Boniface in his 14th epistle. He was a friend of St. Augustine, and he says this: the universal ordering of the Church at its birth took its origin from the office of Blessed Peter, in which is found both its directing power and supreme authority. From him, as from a source, at the time when our religion was in the stage of growth, all churches received their common order. This much is shown by the injunctions of the Council of Nicaea, since it did not venture to make a decree in his regard, recognizing that nothing could be added to his dignity. In fact, it knew that all had been assigned to him by the word of the Lord. So it is clear that this church is to all the churches throughout the world as the head is to the members, and that whoever separates himself from it becomes an exile from the Christian religion, since he ceases to belong to its fellowship. So Pope St. Boniface here, friend of St. Augustine, associate of St. Augustine at the very least, says that the Roman Church is the head to the members, and says that if anyone is cut off from the Roman Church, he's cut off from the Christian religion. It's important to note here that the Orthodox will often make the objection that several church fathers, Optatus, Cyril, John Chrysostom, if I'm remembering correctly, several of the fathers make the point that all of the bishops have the keys. And that is completely correct. However, St. Optatus makes it very clear that the keys go from Christ to Peter to the other apostles, in that order. Christ to Peter to the apostles. Gregory of Nyssa puts it this way. He says, Christ through Peter gave to the bishops the keys of the heavenly honors. And so Orthodox make the objection that all of the bishops have the keys, not just Peter. However, somebody can have the keys, they can have the power of the keys, and not have the right to use those keys, not have the jurisdiction or the authority to use those keys, or at least to use them rightly. As Catholics, we would just suggest, yes, the Orthodox do have the keys. However, in order to exercise those keys properly, it needs to be done in union with the head, the rock, Peter, and his successor. And the last quote I'll use here comes from Pope St. Hadrian. He was the Pope over the Second Council of Nicaea, and this is what he wrote, and this is included in the Acts of the Second Council of Nicaea. He says this in response to a patriarch who started to call himself the Universal Patriarch, and then Rome's going to respond and say, that ain't it. For if he is ecumenical, he must possess primacy over even the see of our own church, the Roman Church, which all the Christian faithful will clearly find absurd, because primatial authority everywhere on earth was given by the Redeemer of the world himself to the blessed apostle Peter, through the same apostle who, though unworthy, we represent, the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Roman Church has held till now, and will hold for all time primacy and sovereign authority, in such a way that if, which we do not credit, anyone calls himself ecumenical or assents to this, he should know that he has no part in the Orthodox faith and is a rebel against our Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The Pope here is responding to this guy calling himself ecumenical patriarch and saying, no, if you were ecumenical, you would have authority over us. But on the contrary, we are the head of the entire church, and Christ gave primatial authority everywhere on earth to Peter, who we represent. So to sum up argument number one, there are no Orthodox quote mines because the Orthodox position of conciliarity is not well attested in the early church. On the contrary, there are dozens and dozens of Catholic quote mines, and it's because the early church was quite vociferous about this idea that supreme authority resided in Rome. The supreme teaching office resided in Rome. Because in order for the Orthodox position to work, you have to rely heavily on empty honorifics or just on flowery language. And quite obviously, there is hyperbole, there is flattery, there are all of these things going on in the early church. And there are many honorifics. However, if you look at the fathers across different contexts, look at what Pope St. Hadrian said. He was writing in response to a dispute about a title that would insinuate authority. He's writing to a real problem and addressing that real problem by saying, you don't have authority, I have authority. Look at all these different contexts in which the church fathers are writing, and over and over and over again, whenever they're writing to friends, whenever they're writing to enemies, whenever the Pope of Rome is writing to quell an issue, whenever the patriarchs in the East are trying to get a problem solved by submitting it to Rome, all these different contexts, they're all saying that Rome has some sort of primacy. And they're appealing to him as if he has a primacy of authority, in which he does say he does in this letter right here. Because even if the Roman Catholic position is falsified, I still don't think there's a very robust argument for the Eastern Orthodox position. And furthermore, which Eastern Orthodox position? Because they don't have a magisterium that's universal to bind them to believe one form of ecclesiology versus another. All the Orthodox ecclesiologies are slightly different. And so even if Roman Catholicism is false, then which one of the Eastern Orthodox ecclesiologies is therefore true? And how do you know? Because the universal attestation of the early church is that Peter was supreme among the apostles and that the Pope represents Peter, or in other words, that Peter speaks through his successors. Let's move on to argument number two. Jesus desires the highest possible degree of unity among his believers, and this is best accomplished by the type of government that best lends itself to unity. I'll break all that down in just a second, but Jesus Christ says this in John's Gospel, that they all may be one, as thou, Father, in me, and I in thee, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you have sent me. So the point here is that Jesus desires maximum possible unity among Christians. And if he desires the maximum amount of unity possible, it's necessary that he gives us a type of government that will allow us to reach that level of unity. And every other form of government, pentarchy, oligarchy, democracy, all these things, all these other forms of government cannot provide the maximum amount of unity. This is how St. Thomas Aquinas explains it. Now it is manifest that what is itself one can more efficaciously bring about unity than several, just as the most efficacious cause of heat is that which is by its nature hot. Therefore, the rule of one man is more useful than the rule of many. Furthermore, it is evident that several persons could by no means preserve the stability of the community if they totally disagreed. For a union is necessary among them if they are to rule at all. Several men, for instance, could not pull a ship in one direction unless joined together in some fashion. Now, several are said to be united according as they come closer to being one. So one man rules better than several who are come near being one. So what's Thomas saying here? He's saying that it's easier for one man to preserve unity in a community because one man has no possibility for division within himself. One man can produce unity in a community that's under him much more easily than 3, 4, 5, 6 men up at the top who have to unify with themselves and then have to provide unity to others. If Christ wanted the maximum amount of unity, it's necessary he provide the type of government which is going to lend itself to that unity. And Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, and anybody who's thought about the matter very much at all will see that a monarchy is the best way to preserve unity within a kingdom. And yes, Christ is the king. He is the monarch. However, we are men and we need a government that befits men. We need a government that is visible, that can speak, that can enforce laws. And in order for us to do any of that, we have to have a visible representative, dare I say a vicar, on earth who can make manifest to us the will of God. So to sum up this second argument, it's the idea that if Christ is going to give us a chance to fulfill his prayer that we all may be one as he and the Father are one, then it's necessary that he give us an institution that lends itself to unity and not division. One man is better able to preserve oneness in his church than many men are able to preserve oneness in their church. And we see this modeled all throughout the Old Testament. Adam is the first monarch of the entire human race. Then Moses becomes, in a certain sense, the monarch of Israel. Then Solomon and David are monarchs. And there's this idea that there's always one man who preserves unity in the kingdom, for better or for worse. Sometimes they have bad leaders, sometimes we have bad popes. But there's one man who is the final authority, and that makes it easier for the people of God to preserve unity. And the third argument why I think orthodoxy just doesn't work is sterility in doctrine. Let me explain what I mean. Some people view this idea of their theology and doctrine being stuck in the 11th century as a strength because the liturgies are still beautiful and intact, because the way of thinking, the way of fasting is much more ancient. I think that's all good and wonderful and beautiful. But there's a real problem here because in the Orthodox churches, you have no way to overcome new objections to the faith. Let me explain what I mean. The highest authority for the Eastern Orthodox is an ecumenical council. Which, that's fine, that's great, that makes sense. If that's your ecclesiology, I can see where you would think that. Acts 15 can certainly be interpreted in that way. However, the early church was adamant about the idea that in order for an ecumenical council to be convened, it had to be done under ancient Rome. It had to be done at least in communion with the Roman Pope. So let's think about this for a second. The highest authority in Orthodoxy is an ecumenical council. And an ecumenical council is impossible without the participation of the Pope of Rome. So effectively what that means is, as an Orthodox, your highest level of authority is inaccessible to you. You can't get to it anymore unless you come back in communion with Rome. And this is one of the reasons that the Orthodox are forced to sort of ossify their theology. Because if they were trying to define anything new, inevitably the Bishop of Constantinople would be at odds with the Bishop of Jerusalem or Russia or something like this. And they would split. So they can't define anything new regarding faith and morals, regarding any dogma at the highest level, because they don't have the Pope. And since they don't have that Pope to preserve unity in their inferiors, since everybody's an equal, everybody's going to do their own thing and split. Let's say hypothetically that Eastern Orthodox Church A wanted to define the Immaculate Conception, let's say, and Eastern Orthodox Church B didn't like that. Well, what's going to happen inevitably whenever one of these two churches tries to define new doctrine? There's going to be a rupture, a split in Christianity over and over and over again. This is why St. Jerome says that one Peter among the 12 is chosen to be their head in order to remove any occasion for division. So the Eastern Orthodox Church, its theology cannot progress anymore, at least on an infallible dogmatic level. It can't, because they don't have the Pope, which is a necessary ingredient for an ecumenical council to work. That's number one. And number two is, if they try to define new doctrines, there's not a final authority outside of the ecumenical council, above the ecumenical council, that can say yes this and no that. And so if the bishops are split and 3 of them go this way and 2 of them go this way, there's going to be an excommunication. There's going to be a rupture in church unity. So to sum this up, the first argument is, I don't find well-attested Orthodox ecclesiology in the first 10 centuries of the church. You can find church fathers who say that all the bishops are equal, that all the bishops have the keys, and I think that that's true, and that's fine. But that doesn't do away with the fact that, as Pope Leo said, all bishops have a common dignity, yet they are not all of the same rank, and that there is a distinction of power. So even if the Roman Catholic position were falsified, I don't see a robust body of evidence suggesting that Christ instituted this sort of oligarchy or democracy. So reason number 1 is a lack of evidence from the early church that supports Orthodox ecclesiology. Reason number 2 is that Christ desires maximum unity among his followers. And if you want to have maximum unity, you must have some sort of monarchical government. An oligarchy or a democracy just doesn't cut it. It doesn't work. Problem number 3 is that Orthodox theology is ossified, at least at the highest level, because they do not have communion with Rome, so they cannot hold an ecumenical council. That's one. And 2 is that if they tried to define new doctrine, they would be sacrificing communion with some of their churches. And if you're an Orthodox Christian and you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you for watching. I hope that you found my presentation charitable or tolerable at best. If you think I'm misrepresenting something or leaving something out, please let me know in the comments. And if you're one of my regular viewers, thank you for watching till the end. As you probably know, I have a baby due in early December, so I'm going to be slowing down my work a little bit. And in order to offset that, I'm hoping to get a little bit of support from my followers, from people who've really benefited from my channel or find value in what I'm saying. If this is the first time you've watched my channel, then please don't give any money. But if you think that my channel has been valuable to you in your spiritual life in any way, then please consider supporting me on Buy Me a Coffee. I'll put the link in the description, but this money is going to go straight to paying my mortgage, paying for my new size 0 diapers that my infant is going to wear. So God bless you, whoever you are. And if you want to see a video explaining the power of the rosary, then click on this video next. God bless.